Discover the amazing, clinically proven health benefits of original Tahitian noni. Original Tahitian noni includes powerful antioxidants, adaptogens, nutrients, and phytonutrients to naturally boost energy levels, immune system function, and overall health. Meticulously sourced from French Polynesia, this is the original superfruit. Accept no imitations. Original Tahitian noni. Visit ATR Health at alchemicaltechrevolution.com. and click on the Shop Here tab for more details.
But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Listening to the Alchemical Tech Revolution, and I am your host, Wayne McRoy. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are around the world. Tonight, we're going to discuss gravity and the mystery of ether. Well, folks, our modern-day physics leaves a lot to be desired, and certainly, although they claim to have made a great many discoveries that reify the belief systems put forward by one Albert Einstein, there's a lot of questions that still go unanswered. Gravity being one of those questions that is unanswered. We still do not understand gravity, its workings, or what is the true source thereof. But tonight, we're going to look at it from a different perspective. We're going to go back to some of the older ways of thinking. We're going to look into the advanced ether physics of the late 1800s and early 1900s, just prior to the onset of Einstein's general theory of relativity, and of course his special theory of relativity as well, which have been adopted wholesale by physicists in the modern era. Now, we still don't have this grand unified model of physics because Einstein's ideas only cover the macro scale of the effects of gravitation, and do not explain the microcosmic effects thereof, and therefore they've also come up with a separate science of physics called quantum physics that does not align in any way, shape, or form with the Einsteinian theories put forward in general relativity and special relativity. So these grand models of physics that we have, they don't match. And although they do everything in their power to try to make them mesh together, they simply do not. There's something missing from the picture here. And this is something that's been discussed by many a physicist over the course of the past century. Now, Einstein described this as the cosmological constant. He described it in a mathematical form, as a variable that he had to insert into his equations to make relativity work. Of course, physicists today will describe this as dark matter or dark energy. And there's various other names applied to it. Quantum physics calls it the quantum vacuum. And of course, all of these things are just man-made reifications to try to explain away why it is that our preconceived notions that have been adopted in mainline physics today don't seem to work unless you apply this variable into the equations. And of course, they've tried to take everything in the realms of science and metaphysics and devise it down to mathematical strategies. Mathematics is the key energy science. And when you understand that, you understand a lot of why it is that everything today that is studied and called science, well, they apply mathematics to it. And of course, this is about the quantification of everything, the measurement of everything, as we've said before, because this is a cybernetics methodology that has been applied across the board to everything. They want to be able to measure a thing or weigh a thing, quantify a thing, because if you do quantify a thing, then that gives you some measure of control over that thing, and that is certainly what they're looking to do. So even if it is an imprecise measurement, as oftentimes it is with these things, it still gives them some measure of control. So therefore, they attempt to quantify everything, and using scientific method to do this is one of the modes of operation of these people in positions of power, and especially those who work in the high echelons of the sciences, studying things like physics. They try to use math to reify the ideas they put forward, and then we wind up with all these different models of physics that don't seem to jive one with another. So we have quantum physics, we have relativity, we have string theory, we have all of these different things that have now arisen in the modern era, and they don't seem to match, and they only apply in certain situations, one with another. There is no grand unified theory of physics. Now, this was a problem that has been faced by scientists studying this for a very, very long time. But I think we came the closest with the advent of a little science known as ether physics, and many of the early physicists in the modern era that are discussed today who were studying electricity, magnetism, gravity, and all of these different things, I think they came closer with this ether physics model. And certainly, we see the reifications that have been put in place by mankind ever since to try to explain these things in a complex way. And we have two different models of physics now that we use, one for the macro scale and one for the micro scale. And they don't interrelate, as we had said before. And they seem to have problems making these things align. Now, when you insert into the place of these man-made mathematical reifications that are known as the cosmological constant or dark matter, dark energy, all these things that they can't seem to explain, but they have to put them there anyway to make it fit into their model. When you replace that notion with the idea of a universal ether, a medium in which all these things exist and manifest, well, guess what? It seems to be a more accurate model. Now, I am of the mindset that the closest picture we could get to how things actually work is presented by a guy named Ken Wheeler, who discussed many different theories of electricity and magnetism, and he's put out books, and he has a YouTube channel where he discusses Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophy and things of that nature as well. And many of the ideas he put forward, the discoveries he's made, seem to make sense, and they align with the older ether physics models. And it seems to be the most correct way of looking at things. Now, the viewpoint he puts forward is nature is very simple, or he would call it simplex, because it's not something that's necessarily easy to understand, but it's easy in its principle of operation. He says gravity, electromagnetism, all of these different things, they operate in the same way that other forces in this world operate, and it's all pressure mediation. And this is probably the best example we have of how to think about these things properly, in my view anyway. He seems to have come very close. Now, Walter Russell also put forward some ideas that were similar to this, and of course, if you listen to guys like Eric Dollard, you'll see there seems to be something to this, and I think what's missing is this acceptance of what is called the ether. Now, our modern physics will describe this away as things, like I said, like dark matter, dark energy, the cosmological constant, or sometimes they call it the quantum vacuum. The quantum vacuum. They call it 0 point. Now, what is being described here, if you look at the ether physics model, you have what's called space and counterspace, and it's a measure of pressure mediation from space into counterspace and from counterspace back into space. And thus you have manifestation in this pattern, this very geometric pattern that appears over and over again when you look at all of these different forces. And it has to do with two opposing geometric shapes in the three-dimensional, the torus and the hyperboloid, which would be like what you would consider maybe an hourglass type shape, a funnel, and all of these things collapse into one another, and it's the opposition one to the other, and all of manifestation and energy seems to flow in this general direction. It flows towards counterspace or away from counterspace. Now, counterspace you could call pure potential, and manifestation, we know what that is. We see that all around us. So when you have this overall view, it's a different philosophical take on all of this, but purely they've tried to eliminate the philosophical from scientific discussions in the modern era. But you need to be able to think outside the box and look at this in this way to understand this model of ether physics. Now, ether, as we had said, this is the medium in which we exist. There has to be this substrate of our reality that all things manifest in and through. Now, think of this with the law of allegory as being similar to air. Okay? We exist in this medium of air, and sound travels through the air, and I don't know if it's necessarily accurate to say it travels. It permeates the air. Sound disturbs the air. It creates a disturbance in the medium, and that is what we perceive as sound. Now, Tesla advised us to think of light as a sound wave in the ether. It's the same kind of thing. So we have all kinds of these man-made reifications that don't stand up to scrutiny when you could think about it in this way. And this has to do with a difference in the philosophies. So if you think of light as being a disturbance in the ether, rather than something that travels through the ether, then you begin to get a whole different perspective of how things operate. So things like the speed of light, well, these are all man-made reifications. The speed of light, it does change. It is not constant, although they do consider it a constant in not only all of their equations, but all their descriptions. Mainstream science says the speed of light is a constant, although they have proven that that's not the case numerous times already. And yet, they still have to hang on to that to make everything work. The speed of light is not constant. It does change. And certainly, this gives more credence to the ether model. So now we have this perturbation in the ether, that would be light. It's the equivalent of sound in the air. The light in the ether is equivalent to the sound in the air when you understand how this works. And we have to rethink the way we do things. You see, the models we have today are based upon particle physics. Everything has to be a fundamental particle. And this is a difference in way of thinking. Once again, we have this whole notion that everything has to be or have some type of a fundamental particle. I think that's a flawed way of thinking, really. Could you describe all forces by simply a fundamental particle? Well, they've attempted to do so. They've even invented reifications like a graviton to do that, or a photon being a light particle. You will never find a light particle, ladies and gentlemen. There is no such thing that's ever been measured in a real, substantive way. It's a man-made reification. They claim it's a photon. And of course, you have many of the quantum scientists out there talking about quantum photons and things of that nature. And it's a misnomer. It's a misdescription. Now, are they seeing real phenomena? Well, most certainly they are, but they're misdescribing it because they're trying to quantify it as a fundamental particle. And once again, this falls back to the application of cybernetics principles for control of these things. So therefore, even though it's an imprecise measurement, it still has some effect for them. But they're misdescribing it. And that is what I think is the most fascinating thing, because if they're misdescribing it, they're missing an important concept that's ever present here. And if they could just figure that out and make that apply to their modern ways of thinking, well, it could be transformative to our society. Now, there are claims that within the auspices of the military-industrial complex's black budget programs, that they have pursued these different models of physics, that they have an off-the-books physics that they pursue in the development of aircraft and spacecraft and various other things that they claim to have. And I think there's some truth to that. I do believe there are technological capabilities and technologies that do exist, that they have built in secret, that operate on these ether physics models. And they keep these carefully hidden from the masses because they don't want people to understand the machinations thereof, because if they do, well, this would transform the very power structure of the world we live in, because you're talking about things like free energy. And they cannot have free energy in a world that they want to control. They can't control that. If they can't control the means and production of energy and the distribution of energy, then that makes a real problem for them. And if you could have unlimited free energy at your disposal, well, the great many things you could do and supply for yourself are unheard of in this modern era. You would not need the production means of these greedy corporations that run things behind the scenes, these multinational corporations that are the shadow government behind the scenes that run things in this world. You wouldn't need them anymore, and therefore they can't have this. So they give up their monopoly of control. You see, it would make things like money obsolete if there was free energy to be had by everybody. Would make travel a lot easier. All of these different things would be transformative to this world, and they don't want people to understand this, so they've kept some of this notion of ether physics, this hidden off-the-books physics, they've kept it wrapped up behind the scenes in special access programs that are very unlikely to come out to public disclosure anytime soon. Now, there is a push by those researchers who look at these things for that stuff to come forward, and we're always seeing people inventing what they would call free energy devices or over unity devices. These things have been done, they've been built, and usually these people are silenced very quickly, or some major corporation buys up their patent rights for this and gives them a nice sum of money to be quiet, and they quietly go away and live out the rest of their days. And these things get hidden from the masses. Certainly we see this is demonstrable in many types of technologies, but certainly we need to understand a little bit about the mystery of the ether if we're going to understand the nature of gravity and the nature of this universe, this world, this reality we live in. So, without further ado, we're going to get into it tonight. We're going to be reading from a book published in 1903, written by William George Hooper, published by Chapman and Hall Limited in London, 1903, as I said. The book is titled Aether and Gravitation. Now, this is before the modern edit, and that's an important notion here. This is before Einstein's theories really mainstreamed and got accepted across the board in the stead of this ether physics model that was popular at this time, because it explained a lot of things, and it was based on older natural sciences that were known. So we're going to read into the introductory notes, and we're going to get as far as we can with this here tonight. And I will try to insert my my own ideas in here with this and give a little context to what's being said, because I really truly think this is important to moving forward in the future in our technological advent here. I think we need to have a firmer understanding of how the world actually operates. Now, we've been so indoctrinated into accepting certain notions of things in the mainstream that we don't even really question them. Like, how many people would actually question, was Einstein smart? Did he know what he was talking about? Did he make correct assumptions here? And of course, you always see the mainstream scientific community reifying these notions of Einstein, or claiming that they've proven that Einstein's relativity is actually the most accurate model we have through various means, one of which is measuring stars at a distance, watching stars, and describing some of the gravitational effects thereof based on computer models and nothing more, based upon radio telescopes, the data they get from radio telescopes, and they put through a computer and devise a simulation, and then they observe the simulation and they say, oh, okay, this lines up with Einstein's theories. Well, they have a preconceived notion that they're working with to begin with, so they're making assumptions. And when you make assumptions, well, that doesn't always end well if you're trying to get to the truth. This is called confirmation bias, and of course they use this all the time. So that being the case, we can see that there's a lot of discrepancy perhaps involved with this. So let's get into the introductory notes here, and we'll see what we could confirm here. The author in this work endeavors to solve the greatest scientific problem that has puzzled scientists for the past 200 years. The question has arisen over and over again since the discovery of universal gravitation by Sir Isaac Newton as to what is the physical cause of the attraction of gravitation. Action at a distance has long ceased to be recognized as a possible phenomenon, although up to the present the medium and method of gravitational attraction has not yet been discovered. And I'm going to pause for a moment. Even unto today, the method and medium of gravitation has still not yet been discovered. But I think in the special access programs they're a little closer, because at least they're addressing the medium of the gravitation phenomenon. And of course, we see action at a distance. This is what Einstein described as spooky action at a distance. In this viewpoint, they're saying that doesn't seem feasible, has long ceased to be recognized as a possible phenomenon. Of course, in the modern era, quantum physics would say spooky action at a distance certainly is feasible. So we see some things that have come about since the writing of this book that seem to apply to our accepted physics models, but there's still the underlying question. We really don't understand what gravity is or how it works. We don't understand the method or the medium in which it works. Now, maybe within the black budget community, they're a little closer, and I think that's the case, because at least they're recognizing the medium when you're looking at it through the ether physics lens. Let's continue on. It is generally, however, accepted by scientists that the only possible medium which can give rise to the phenomena incidental to and associated with the law of gravitation must be the universal ether, which forms the common medium of all phenomena associated with light, heat, electricity, and magnetism. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Now, physicists today will make no such mention or contention here. They will go the opposite direction with this. They will firmly deny the existence of the ether. They will claim the ether has been disproven when nothing of the sort has really occurred. But let's continue on. It is impossible, however, to reconcile gravitational phenomena with the present conception of the universal ether medium, and a new theory is therefore demanded before the long sought-for explanation will be forthcoming. Professor Glazebrook definitely states the necessity for a new theory in his work on J.C. Maxwell, page 221, where he writes, quote, "We are waiting for someone to give us a theory of the ether which shall include the facts of electricity and magnetism, luminous radiation, and it may be gravitation." End quote. A new theory of the ether is also demanded in view of the recent experimental results of Professor Lebedew and Nichols and Hull of America. It is logically impossible to reconcile a frictionless ether with the results relative to the pressure of light waves. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. Now we're getting a little closer, I think, to what the actual model of things is. Notice he's mentioning the pressure of light waves. A frictionless ether, I don't think it's necessarily frictionless, but the pressure of the light waves, you see, it's closer to what Mr. Ken Wheeler says. It's pressure mediation. They were closer to understanding this towards the end of the phase of physics known as ether physics, when Einstein stepped in and everybody shifted their focus and their thinking in the mainstream towards his physics models, which, by the way, were largely lifted from a guy named Henri Poincaré. And you don't know that, probably, but you should, because Einstein, in my view, this character he's become, this meme that he's become, is largely a construct. Now, there was a real guy named Einstein, and yeah, he was smart, he was a scientist, he was quirky, but many of his ideas were lifted from elsewhere. Let's put it that way. And the character became a construct, and it is still, to this day, associated with genius. Anybody who calls you an Einstein would claim you're a genius. And the bitter irony is, if you look at the name Einstein in German, it means one stone, which was kind of an insult back in days past in Germany. If they said you were one stone, that meant you weren't very bright or weren't very smart. But that's beside the point. So we have this irony that seems to be inherent here, and you could see how the characterization of Einstein has become a social construct. It's a poke in the eye for people who understand Einstein, associated with brilliance, but really the term in its etymological roots means you're not very bright. Do you see how they do these things, folks? The social engineers of this world. And this is certainly one of the things that stands out with all of this, because much of our modern physics is built upon the backbone of the work of Mr. Einstein in the modern era. Let's read on here. In the following pages of this work, the author has endeavored to perfect a theory which will bring ethereal physics more into harmony with modern observation and experiments, and by so doing, believes that he has found the key that will unlock the problem not only of the cause of universal gravitation, but also other problems of physical sciences. The author has taken Newton's rules of philosophy as his guide in the making of the new theory, as he believes that if any man knew anything of the rules of philosophy, that man was Sir Isaac Newton. The first chapter, therefore, deals with the generally recognized rules which govern philosophical reasoning, the same being 3 in number, the fundamental rule being that in making any hypothesis, the results of experience as obtained by observation and experiments must not be violated. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So he's looking at this through a philosophical lens, from much the same philosophical lens that Sir Isaac Newton would have used in describing these things, and I think we're a little closer to the actual workings of things when we go back to some of these older ways of thinking, because these are based upon old natural sciences. So let's go ahead and continue on here. Those properties... In applying the rules to the present theory of the ether, he found that the theory as at present recognized violated 2 of the most important rules of philosophy, because while ether is supposed to be matter, Yet it failed to fulfill the primary property of all matter. That is, it is not subject to the law of gravitation. If ether is matter, then to be strictly logical and philosophical, it must possess the properties of matter as revealed by observation and experiment. I'm going to pause for a moment here. So ether, plain and simply, cannot be the same as matter. And when we're trying to think of this medium, of ether as being some type of matter, I think that that's a misnomer. And of course, this is actually what he's talking about here. Those properties are given in Chapter 3, where it is shown that they are atomicity, heaviness or weight, elasticity, density, inertia, and compressibility. To be strictly logical and philosophical, the author was compelled to postulate similar properties for the ether, or else his hypotheses would controvert the results of all experience. So I'm going to pause for a moment. So ether, although it is not matter, it may have some of the same properties of matter, because if you apply this philosophical way of thinking, or the Hermetic philosophy, to it, you could say, as above, so below. So perhaps it does have some of the same properties as matter. Or perhaps it is, as you might find, according to the secret doctrine of the various occult fraternities, it is what they would call a finer form of matter, a more etheric form of matter. It's less dense in the way that they term it, and therefore you can apply the rules of matter to it in certain regards, but it is a finer state of matter, and therefore in the physical we cannot accurately measure it in such a way because we are more dense. Physicality is more dense, it is less dense. And this all goes back to this whole notion of frequency and vibration, which Tesla advised us that in order to understand the operations and machinations of this universe, we need to think in terms of frequency and vibration. So if this is a finer frequency than what we are attuned to here, then we can scarcely recognize the perturbation in the ether unless it manifests in the physical. So therefore, it's kind of like the analogy of looking at the effects of the wind. You certainly can't deny that the wind exists. You can't see it. You can't truly accurately measure it. You can only measure the effects of it. It's the same thing here being postulated, essentially. So at any rate, let's continue on here. The application of these properties to the ether will be found in Chapter 4 of this book, where the author has postulated atomicity, heaviness or weight, density, elasticity, inertia, and compressibility for the ether, and so brought the theory of the ether into perfect harmony with all observation and experiments relative to ordinary matter. It will be shown that James Clerk Maxwell also definitely affirms the atomicity of the ether, while Tyndall and Huygens also use the term particles of ether over and over again. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So this is the blending of more modern ways of thinking with older ways of thinking. You see, they always have to try to apply a fundamental particle to a thing. Why is that? Well, this goes back to basic philosophies. There's only ever been two postulates of philosophy in this world as it pertains to physics. There's the atomistic way of thinking, wherein everything is based upon a fundamental particle, or there's the ether theory. And these two things don't jive, but they've been trying to make them jive because, well, it's about quantifying everything, you see. They want to be able to accurately measure this. And in so doing, that gives them some modicum of control over it. This is one of the principal foundations of cybernetics. If you can measure a thing, you can control a thing. That's the most important part. So even though this is etheric matter of a sort that they're trying to measure, this ether field, they still want some type of a way to measure it. So they try to think of it or reify it in terms of particles, much like if you look on the subatomic scale, and you really delve these things back to their roots, you will find that the notion of the electron, well, this is just a man-made reification of measurement. It's never really truly been observed outside of some type of a computer simulation, the electron. They cannot look into atoms and seeing the moving electron around there as depicted in the models. This is just a measurement of energy put off by an atom. So it's a man-made reification, really, much like the notion of an atom is a man-made reification. And of course, if you look back into the old occult teachings, you find that all matter, all energy, has a fundamental particle to it in that as well. And they call this either the keynote or the key atom or some such thing like that. I can't think of the exact term they use, but certainly they use the same methodologies to try to describe certain concepts here, because we do have to acknowledge that there are fundamental particles. But I don't think this explains all phenomena. And that's wherein this misnomer comes in, because they try to describe everything in terms of fundamental particles interacting and bumping into one another, and it doesn't always seem to apply. But let's go ahead and we'll continue reading here. Moreover, in view of the most recent researches in electricity made by Sir William Crookes and Professor J.J. Thomson, we are compelled to accept an atomic basis for electricity, and as Dr. Lodge in his modern views of electricity states that, quote, ether is made up of positive and negative electricity, end quote. Then, unless we postulate atomicity for the ether, we have to suppose that it is possible for a non-atomic body, which would be ether, to be made up of atoms or corpuscles, which conclusion is absurd and therefore must be rejected as illogical and unphilosophical. And I'm going to pause for a moment here. So now, here's where we get into assumptions, and I think this is where a lot of science has gotten it wrong in the past and still gets it wrong today. You see, when they discovered and were pursuing this avenue of thought of ether physics, they didn't understand it, they couldn't wrap their heads around it, and so they tried to describe it in ways that correlate with how we would observe and measure matter. So they made these presuppositions, and they inserted them into here. So now they're assuming that ether would have to be some type of matter, if it is indeed a substrate in which we exist. And therefore they've applied these properties of matter in the form of atomism, once again fundamental particles, to describe these things. And although they say it's illogical and unphilosophical or absurd to do so because they don't really know the true nature of it, this is how they've done it anyway, because they want to try to figure out the best ways to utilize this, the best ways to perhaps understand it. And maybe it lies outside the realms of human understanding. I don't know. I certainly don't have the answers. But what they've done is they've tried to apply standards of physics that we do understand to this problem, to this conundrum. And in so doing, they've made certain postulations here. And I think this guy was getting pretty close in his assessment here of things, or at least it gives us a generalized overview of how this works. What is the mystery of the ether, and how does gravitation relate to it? Let's continue on. After postulating atomicity for the ether, we are then able to apply the Newtonian law of gravitation to it, which distinctly affirms that, quote, every particle of matter attracts every other particle, end quote. And so we arrive at Thomas Young's fourth hypothesis, given in the Philosophical Transactions of 1802, where he asserts that, quote, all material bodies have an attraction for the ethereal medium, by means of which it is accumulated within their substance and for a small distance around them in a state of greater density, end quote. He adds the significant remark that this hypothesis is opposed to that of Newton's. With an atomic and gravitate ether, it is shown in Chapter 4 how the elasticity, density, and inertia of the medium are brought into harmony with all observations and experiments. So I'm going to pause again here to add a little bit more context to this. So essentially, based upon this notion of ether being a type of matter and therefore having some type of a fundamental particle to it, he could apply Newton's theory to this. Now, some would call it a law. I don't know if it's a law. I think gravitation's more of a theory than a law because they don't understand what its source point is. They don't understand its machinations or how it operates or what its relation is to other known forces like electricity, magnetism, all of these things, the strong and weak nuclear forces that are known. And certainly we're still learning. But what they claim then is that they have to make this assumption in order to apply Newton's rules to it. So see, they're trying to bend this medium into fitting in Newton's theory of gravitation, wherein he asserts that all matter have an attraction towards one another. And the reification being made here in this work of Thomas Young, in the hypothesis he gave in 1802, is that it's not necessarily these masses that are attracted one towards another or have a gravitational attraction towards one another. It's that it somehow attracts this etheric medium to itself and therefore causes a slight state of more density, and that is what pulls the bodies towards one another. Now, I don't think it's been adequately demonstrated that all masses attract one to another. Certainly, if this was the case, wouldn't we have things maybe orbiting around us? I mean, we are masses after all. Or things would fly towards us at all times. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't stand up to reason. Of course, they say it's got to be a very large body, and there's got to be some type of motion of that body. It's got to be spinning. And I don't think that's necessarily a true standard that holds up here. Now, some in the physics community may go ahead and offer some feedback about that, or try to show that that is the case. That's what goes on, that it's mass and movement together. Mass and spin together are what create gravity. I don't know. Has that ever been adequately demonstrated? Can it ever be adequately demonstrated? We don't know. But that's the problem. We have to make a lot of assumptions to get there. And that's what's been done. So, at any rate, we see here that this gentleman postulates that it has more to do with the ether than it does with the mass of bodies. It's about the attraction of ether unto itself, or the density of the ether within. So let's read on here. It says, in the succeeding chapters, the new theory is applied to the phenomena of heat, light, electricity, and magnetism, and the principles enunciated therein are then applied to solar and stellar phenomena. One of the greatest stumbling blocks to the discovery of the physical cause of gravitation, apart from the unphilosophical theory of the ether medium, lies in the fact that apparently the law of gravitation only recognizes a force of one kind. Dr. Lodge refers to this phase of the subject on page 39 of his Modern Views of Matter, just published. It is here where scientists have failed to solve the problem of universal gravitation, as there are two forces at work in the solar system and not one. That is, if we are to accept the results of up-to-date experiments in relation to radiant light and heat, as performed by Professor Lebedew and Nichols and Hull of America. Their experiments conclusively prove that light waves exert a pressure upon all bodies on which they fall, and by no reasoning can this pressure be resolved into an attractive force. So I'm going to pause for a moment here. So now the postulation is there's two opposing forces involved with gravitation, and this, in my estimation, is where the rubber meets the road. This would be almost the equivalence of electromagnetism. They are one and the same force. Electromagnetism. They're two polar opposites of the same force. Well, the postulation being made here is that gravity has an oppositional force to it too that we scarcely understand as human beings and we don't see. So would this be anti-gravity? Is that what we would call it? Perhaps. And perhaps these things have been discussed in some experiments that came later, especially as relates to a gentleman named Dr. T. Townsend Brown, and some of his discoveries in the 19-teens and 1920s, which were put forward in military projects in the 1950s, and all of this research went deep black thereafter. Project Winter Haven, folks, look it up. It's extremely important to understanding the nature of gravitation, because you see, it stands to reason to think that we have to have some kind of a counter force of gravity, of what we accept as gravity, just like electricity and magnetism are the polar opposites of the same set of forces there. Same thing can be implied in looking at what we would call the weak atomic force and the strong atomic force. The nuclear forces that are said to hold together the particles that they like to use so much. We have the weak attractive force and the strong force in nuclear physics. So understanding these things, it would stand to reason that if gravity is of the same ilk as electricity and magnetism and the strong and weak nuclear forces, there would be a counterforce involved there. And certainly, I think that may be the case. And I think all of these things are just different manifestations of the same inherent force. And it's based upon pressure mediation. As we just read here, that it would seem that light waves exert a pressure upon all bodies on which they fall, which this stands in opposition to gravitational theory as postulated by some of the early physicists. This flies in the face of reason. Unless, of course, you reject this notion that ether is fundamentally a type of matter. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, I don't know. But you can't necessarily apply across the board all the same measures to it. And likewise, you would also have to reject the notion that there's perhaps some type of a foundational or fundamental particle that has something to do with everything. I think it's a flawed way of thinking. But they do it for various reasons. Like I said, it's all about trying to measure or quantify a thing. They have to have a fundamental particle interaction involved. And certainly, I don't think that necessarily applies with forces. You could understand it better by applying the reasoning of pressure mediation to it, in my view. But certainly they try to describe it in all these complex ways, and it's really a very simple thing to explain when you understand the machinations of it, really. But it takes a little thinking outside the box. That's the whole problem. Because we can't really understand the nature of this substrate in which we all exist, this ether. The medium of the ether. It has to be there. But we don't know exactly how it operates or how we can accurately measure it or what the effects of forces are in the ether and what they look like in the physical manifestation thereof. And that's where the problem comes in. All we could do is measure the physical effects. Like I said, go back to the allegory of wind. Once again, we can't really measure wind. We could measure the effects of wind. You see, it's the same kind of thing with the ether. You're not really measuring the air. You're measuring the effects on the air of this perturbance, this disturbance in the medium. That's what you're actually looking at. It's the same thing with ether. So when you could wrap your head around that concept and understand that all we could do is observe the effects on the physical in order to understand this medium a little better, then you begin to get a clearer view of things. And of course, I hope I'm not losing folks with this, because I think this is something that's massively important if our science is to advance any further and help humanity to overcome some of the problems that we have here today. So at any rate, let's go ahead and read on. Herschel, in his lectures on scientific subjects, definitely refers to the existence of a repulsive force in the solar system and asserts that it offers the most interesting prospect of any future discovery. The author has therefore attacked the problem of the cause of gravitation by trying to solve the problem of the cause of the repulsive force, which has been experimentally demonstrated to exist by Professor Lebedew and others. In his efforts to ascertain the physical cause of the centrifugal force, he has been assisted by an unknown and original essay written by an unknown writer over 20 years ago. Going to pause for a moment. So that would be around 1883 sometime. That unknown writer was the author's father, who wrote an essay on the complementary law of gravitation, and if it had not been for that essay, the present work would never have been attempted. The main object of the author, in chapters 6, 7, and 8 in this book, is to prove beyond the possibility of contradiction from the phenomena of heat, light, and electricity the existence of two forces in the solar system, and by doing so, to bring our philosophy of the ether medium and all gravitational phenomena into harmony with all observation and experiments, which at present is not the case. In seeking to do this, he found that the new theory of the ether harmonized with views given by Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell in relation to electric and magnetic phenomena, and by the new theory, Maxwell's hypothesis of physical lines of force receives a definite and physical basis. In Chapter 10 of this book, the author endeavors to show what the electrokinetic energy is, which term is used by James Clerk Maxwell, the term being brought for the first time into harmony with our experience. The electromagnetic theory of light also receives fresh light from the new theory of an atomic and gravitating ether. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. So how close did this Hooper gentleman come? I can't say for certain, but certainly I think his thinking is in the right direction, because he began to try to reify what our observations are with the ether model. And that being the case, we can have a closer view and association of what's what with this, as opposed to the way of thinking we have today. I think it's misaligned from what it could be. And I certainly think that the advent of Einstein on the scene was to lead the external view of the public away from what perhaps was coming to be known within the inner circles of power in this world, because that's always been the case. There's always been this sort of breakaway civilization, if you will, at least in the modern era, that wants to maintain their grip and control of power and wealth in this place, and they certainly have access to things that we do not. So I think that's the case with this. So let's go ahead and we shall read on here. In the succeeding chapters, the theory is applied to Newton's laws of motion and Kepler's laws and is found to harmonize with all the results given by these laws. Such a result is a distinct advance on the application of a frictionless ether to solar and stellar phenomena, as it is impossible for Kepler's laws to be reconciled in any way with our present theory of the ether. So therefore, I'm going to pause there and give a little context to this. So we see this frictionless ether. So there's no friction in the ether. Now this is different from what we see in physical phenomena. Because there's no friction in ether, well, this causes a sort of problem in our understanding. Because we are used to seeing friction or resistance to motion, and in the ether it operates differently. That's why they would say light will actually travel, this is how they would term it, travel almost indefinitely as far as it goes at the speed that it permeates at, out into infinity. Whereas within the physical medium that we exist in, the air, well, there's limitations to how far things will go within that medium. So sound has a finite cutoff point because it will fizzle out over time because it has resistance. It experiences resistance, friction in the physical medium. But seeing as how ether is not strictly a physical medium, there's no friction. So therefore, this creates a whole different set of rules, and I think some of this is perhaps understood by those major corporations, aerospace corporations, who perhaps develop anti-gravitic propulsion systems. Now, if you base some of this notion on things said by guys like Bob Lazar, they understand that there's two different distinctions of gravity, gravity A and gravity B. And they've made waveform generators to produce these effects. Now, I don't know if you can take everything Lazar says at face value or not, but this is the understanding that he put forward in a video he put out way back in 1990, I want to say, or 1989, discussing these things that he allegedly experienced at S4, the military base where he allegedly was reverse engineering UFO craft. And they had made these gravity generators accordingly, based upon gravity A and gravity B, as he describes it in that video. You could go back and look this up. This is still available on YouTube. At least it was last I checked. You could find Bob Lazar's video talking about this stuff, the original video. And it's interesting to take into consideration because this actually addresses the same thing this author is addressing here, that there is this type of counterforce, this repulsive force associated with gravity that they don't understand and doesn't seem to align with the models that they had at the time or still have today. And when you begin to understand that maybe there's something to this, you could get a little closer to how it works. But at any rate, let's go ahead and we shall read on. In the concluding chapter on the unity of the universe, certain views are suggested as to the ultimate constitution of all matter, upon an ethereal basis which hypothesis practically resolves itself into an electric basis for all matter. It is suggested that ether and electricity are one and the same medium, both being a form of matter, and both possessing exactly the same properties vis-a-vis atomicity, weight, density, elasticity, inertia, and compressibility. This view of matter harmonizes with the most modern views of matter as suggested by Sir Oliver Lodge in his Romanes Lecture 1903. The author has accepted Newton's way of spelling ether with the A in the front, as given in his work on optics, and has given ethereal the same suffix as material in order to differentiate the word from ethereal, spelled with an E, which is too metaphysical a term for a material medium. So therefore, this guy accepts this physical notion of ether. He describes it as almost a physical thing. And is that the case? I don't know for certain. I think we need to understand that physics and metaphysics are both describing the same thing. It's two opposing sides of the same coin, ladies and gentlemen. And metaphysics, when properly applied, can be seen in the physical and measured in the physical. Same type of thing here. So is the ether truly a type of matter? Is electricity the same type of matter? And are these all one and the same thing? I don't know, but it makes sense that the electromagnetic force and the gravitational force are related. Maybe they're two separate manifestations of the same phenomenon. I think that may be the case. And when you have a firm understanding of this notion of this substrate to all our reality called ether, this medium in which we exist, and perhaps the permutations of that being applied differently, then we can maybe understand something a little greater here. Maybe it is possible to influence or affect this ether, and if you could affect this medium and perhaps create pockets of void or counter space in this medium, or pressure systems would probably be the best way to describe this, within the ether, you can cause some very real physical world effects here. Now, this is an interesting thing to think about, and like I said, I think some of the aerospace corporations have a better grasp of this than what I could possibly have. But let's get into the philosophy of gravitation. Gravitation. In the realm of science, there exists a force or law that pervades and influences all nature, and from the power of which nothing, not even an atom, is free. It holds together the component parts of each and every individual world, and in the world's revolving prevents both its inhabitants and its vegetation from being whirled off of its surface into space. It exists in each and every central sun, and circles round each sun its associated system of planets. It rolls each satellite around its primary planet, and regulates the comet's mysterious flight into the depths of space, while the pendulation of even the remotest star is accomplished by this same force. Our own rocking world obeys the same mysterious power that seems to grasp the entire material creation as with the grasp of the infinite. It exists in and influences every atom whose combinations compose and constitute the entire material creation, or each and every orb that bespangle the blue infinity. As is readily seen, it weaves, as it were, around each and all, a mysterious network or chain that binds star to star and world to world, blending all into one entire vast and complete unity. It decides all their orbits and distances, regulates and controls all their motions, from the most simple even to the more complex and intricate, ultimately producing that wondrous and beatious order, unity, and harmony that everywhere pervade and blend all the universe into one grand and harmonious whole. That law, I need hardly say, is the law of gravitation. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Is gravity a law? I think it's more akin to a theory because we don't truly understand the root causes of gravity. And he's going to get into that here in this second portion here, the cause of gravitation. Now, the question arises, and indeed has arisen 1,000 times since the discovery of this law by Sir Isaac Newton over 200 years ago, as to what is the physical cause, the true explanation of this universal attraction. Maclaurin, in his work on the philosophical discoveries of Sir Isaac Newton, says, quote, "In all cases when bodies seem to act upon each other at a distance and tend towards one another without any apparent cause impelling them, this force has been commonly called attraction." And this term is frequently used by Sir Isaac Newton, but he gives repeated caution that he pretends not by the use of this term to define the nature of the power or the manner in which it acts, nor does he ever affirm or insinuate that a body can act upon another body at a distance, but by the intervention of other bodies, end quote. So I'm going to pause for a moment. So it's a misnomer to say that Newton said that massive bodies attract one another, are compelled towards one another. He didn't make that claim at all, according to this. But this is something that is constantly reiterated by modern science. They seem to think that this is what Newton was suggesting. But did he really? You see, Sir Isaac Newton was just as much a metaphysicist as he was a physicist. He studied the occult just as much as he studied science. He studied philosophy just as much as he studied science. So when you understand this, maybe there was a level of understanding there that Newton had that he couldn't really convey accurately in words to many of the scientific minds of the day, ones who didn't understand this way of thinking. But let's continue on. So the results of modern discovery show that action at a distance without the intervention of any medium, as for example the sun attracting the earth, is not the universal condition which governs all so-called forces. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. So this spooky action at a distance thing doesn't seem feasible to observation, does it? And you'll notice that this is something that the cult of quantum has arisen around. But that's a side note for another day. Let's continue on. It is now recognized that light and heat are both forms of energy, and therefore forces, using the term in the same sense that is applied to gravitation. Both light and heat are transmitted through space with finite velocity through the intervention of a medium, the universal ether. It is therefore only reasonable to suppose that if one or more particular kinds of energy or forces require a medium for their transmission, why not another force, as for example gravitation? So I'm going to pause there. So now they're saying that light and heat, they require a medium to transmit through. Otherwise, they can't go through it. So there has to be something there. So wouldn't it be the same case for gravitation? Just another type of force. So forces need a medium to transmit through or travel through. Now, this also makes us question our modern understanding of what is space or outer space. Because certainly it's demonstrable. Light travels through that, doesn't it? We see the stars in the sky, the light emitted from the stars in the sky, from the sun. So is this truly a void? Is it truly a vacuum? Is it truly something that has no medium or constituency to it, no matter to it whatsoever? And then, of course, all the reifications you see in the realm of quantum, where they say it would seem that this vacuum, there's this quantum vacuum energy, there's these particles that seem to phase in and out of manifestation in reality, in the physical here, in this quantum vacuum, and perhaps that's the nature of space. So therefore they could derive this quantum vacuum energy, this 0-point energy from this. Do you see how it's very hard to wrap your brain around a lot of this? Because they contradict themselves constantly. So space is not the absence of all matter. It is not a true vacuum in that sense, is it? And of course they'll say, oh, it's not really a true vacuum because there's still particles out there, but they're so spread apart that it's impossible for things to travel through them and it will have any type of effect on the inertia of a thing. You see, that's another thing they tell us. There's no resistance in space. It lacks this notion of friction. Well, if there's particles in space demonstrably, according to quantum theory and such things, then there would have to be some type of a resistance or a friction in space. But they allege there's not. And this is one of the properties accepted of the ether. It's a frictionless medium. So does ether permeate space? Or is space just a physical manifestation of ether devoid of what we would consider physical matter? I don't know. I don't have the answers to this. But certainly we could see the flaws in the thinking of the mainstream science of today. But at any rate, let's read on here. So the question has been postulated here. If other forces require a medium for transmission, wouldn't gravity also require a medium? Gravitation is a universal force which operates throughout the length and breadth of the entire universe, and if there be a medium which is to gravitation what the ether is to light and heat, the question at once confronts us as to what are the characteristics, properties, and qualities of that universal medium, which is to form the physical basis of this universal attraction. Newton himself suggested that gravitation was due to an ethereal, subtle medium which filled all space. So I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. And this is something mainstream science still does not talk about. Newton postulated there had to be an ether. This is not something that is readily accepted by mainstream science today. They think that's an incorrect way of thinking. But I think Newton was a little bit more keen on these things than our modern sciences are. So he suggested there had to be an ethereal, subtle medium. Now he uses the word subtle, and this comes directly from the secret schools because that's one of the ways in which they describe etheric forms. It's a more subtle form of matter. That's what they claim. So let's read on. In his well-known letter to Bentley, Newton writes as followed. Now this is from Isaac Newton. Quote, that gravity should be innate, inherent, and essential to matter, so that one body can act upon another body at a distance through a vacuum without the mediation of anything else, by and through which their action and force may be conveyed from one to another, is to me so great an absurdity that I believe no man who has any philosophical nature or competent faculty of thinking can ever fall into it." End quote. And that's exactly what quantum science postulates today, folks. So Sir Isaac Newton thinks it absurd. And there's a great many people who would think it absurd, but of course they will present this stuff to you and call it science, claim it's fact, it's proven, that this theory is proven, much like everything else, and that the experts all agree, and they therefore will silence you about that. And remember what Voltaire advised us: he who could make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And if this is an absurdity, according to Newton, well, what atrocities can be committed in the name of this notion? Who knows? Maybe things like fake moon landings and stuff like that. Who can say for sure what has all been done in the name of science to cover up perhaps the true nature of our reality? Don't know, but let's carry on here. Let's read on. We also know from his queries in his book on optics that he sought for the explanation of gravitation in the properties of a subtle ethereal medium diffused over all the universe. Maclaurin on this point says, quote, "It appears from his letters to Boyle that this was his opinion early, and if he did not publish his opinion sooner, it proceeded from hence only that he found he was not able from experiment and observation to give a satisfactory account of this medium, and the manner of its operation in producing the chief phenomena of nature." End quote. Therefore, if we accept Newton's suggestion and endeavor to trace the physical cause of gravitation in the qualities, properties, and motions of their subtle ethereal medium to which he refers, we shall be simply working on the lines laid down by Sir Isaac Newton himself. I wish, therefore, to premise that the future pages of this work will deal with the hypothesis of this ethereal medium by which will be accounted for, and that on a satisfactory and physical basis, the universal law of gravitation. So this guy in this work was trying to go back to the original source material, go back to Sir Isaac Newton's postulations, and work from there rather than making assumptions. So like I said, I think perhaps this Hooper gentleman maybe came a little bit closer to the mark than what we have in the modern era. So next he talks about rules of philosophy. In order that we may rightly understand the making of any hypothesis, I purpose giving some rules laid down by such philosophers as Newton and Herschel, so that we may be guided by right principles in the development of this new hypothesis as to the cause of gravitation. The rules that govern the making of any hypotheses, so far as I can discern, may be summed up under the three following heads. Number 1, simplicity of conception. Number 2, agreement with experience, observation, and experiment. And number 3, satisfactorily accounting for and explaining all phenomena sought to be explained. So I'm going to pause for a moment. So these three important rules can be applied across the board. The number 1 rule is simplicity of conception. So therefore, when you apply a conception that is overly complicated, that most people have a hard time wrapping their minds around, perhaps it's flawed. It's the Occam's razor type of an approach here. Simplicity. The simplest explanation is usually the plausible explanation. Well, they give us all kinds of complex reifications of things that they need to mathematically try to prove to us to make things work, and it's overly complex for no reason, when if you can look at it based upon our natural observations, things in this world seem to operate under the auspices of pressure mediation, and would that not be the same across the board in something like an ether? But what does pressure in the ether look like as compared to pressure in the physical? And that's wherein maybe the comparisons can be made, and we could draw some conclusions based upon observation there. But then he goes into a little bit more detail about the first rule, simplicity of conception. From this rule, we learn that the hypothesis must be simple in conception and simple in its fundamental principles, and further, that the same characteristic of simplicity must mark each step of its development. This rule of simplicity is distinctly laid out by Sir Isaac Newton in his Principia, Book 3, under the heading Regulae Philosophandi. In that work, he writes, quote, and it gives it here in the original language, but I'm just going to read the English translation, quote, nature is simple and does not abound in superfluous causes of things, end quote. He further states that, quote, not more of the natural causes of things ought to be admitted than those which are true and suffice to explain phenomena. In the nature of philosophy, nothing is done in vain, and by means of many things it is done in vain when it can be done by fewer. For nature is simple and does not abound in superfluous causes, end quote. Well, again, in rule number 3, he adds, quote, nature is simple and always agrees with itself, end quote. So, folks, we're getting to the heart of the matter. Nature is simple. It doesn't have to be complex. Man, in trying to make his own reifications of things, overly complexifies everything. We overcomplicate things. We overthink it. If you approach the problem based upon your natural observation, the simplicity inherent in nature, then you can more readily solve the problem or understand the conception. Simple. We will also consider simplicity as a fundamental principle of all true hypotheses. On this point, he writes, quote, all the hypotheses should tend to simplicity and harmony. The new suppositions revolve themselves into the old ones, or at least only require some easy modification of the hypothesis first assumed. In false theories, the contrary is the case, end quote. So Sir Isaac Newton advised us that the more complexity added to things, the more likely that the theory is false. Understand? If it doesn't build off of some of the old things that were understood about natural science way in the past, or natural philosophy, if it doesn't agree with that or build upon that, then it's likely false. And how many false theories do we see out there today? Things that don't align with the old ways of thinking. There's a lot, isn't there? Thus, it is the very essence of philosophy to build upon a foundation of simplicity combined with the results of experience, observation, and experiment. For example, if we desired to form a hypothesis as to the cause of day and night, 2 hypotheses might be assigned as the cause. First, that the earth revolves on its axis once a day and so presents each part successively to the light and heat of the sun, and second, that the sun revolves round the earth once every 24 hours. But such an assumption as the latter would involve the revolution of the sun through an immense orbit at an enormous velocity in order for the journey to be accomplished in the time. So that it is much simpler to conceive of the earth revolving on its axis once every 24 hours than it is for the sun to perform this journey in the same period. Hence, the rule of simplicity is in favor of day and night being caused by the revolving of the earth on its axis. The same rule might be illustrated in many ways, but, however illustrated, the principle, according to Newton, always holds good, that all effects are produced by the simplest causes, and if there are apparently 2 causes to the same phenomenon, then the simpler cause is the true and correct one. So that in the making and development of any hypotheses of the physical cause of gravitation, this rule of simplicity must always be recognized, and in conjunction with the other rules, we must seek to make our hypotheses so as to be able to account and explain all phenomena sought to be explained. So I'm going to pause for a moment here. So basically, this is this whole notion of Occam's razor that the mainstream scientific community so very much likes to elevate in prominence, except when it comes to their own favorite theories. Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is probably the true explanation. Nature is simple. and yet they overly complexify and complicate everything. They make a particle zoo. Everything is a more and more profoundly small, fundamental particle. Everything's an interaction of all these bumping particles. There's the atom, but then the atom, being the fundamental particle, was broken down into other fundamental particles, the proton, the neutron, the electron, and they were broken down into quarks and various other things, and we have this entire particle zoo that's come about, and they're always claiming to discover new subatomic particles and interactions of all of these things, and it's all based upon fraud, folks, and false assumptions about things. It's not the simplest explanation. Let's put it that way. And if it's not the simplest explanation, and it's not observable in our experience and observation and experimentation over and over again, then it's likely not true. It's likely a false theory. And this we were advised by Sir Isaac Newton. So keep that in mind, especially as it pertains to these things. Now, the second rule, experience. Newton fully recognized the necessity of experience in philosophy. He saw the absolute necessity of appealing to experience, observation, and experiment, both as a basis for philosophical reasoning and further, for the data which were necessary to verify particular applications of the hypotheses suggested. In his Rules of Philosophy, referring to experience as a guide, he says, quote, "This is the basis of philosophy," end quote. Herschel, writing on the same subject in his Natural Philosophy, writes thus with regard to experience, quote, "We have pointed out that the great and indeed the only ultimate source of our knowledge of nature and its laws is experience, by which I mean not the experience of one man only or of one generation, but the accumulated experience of all mankind in all ages registered in books or recorded in tradition. But experience may be acquired in two ways, either first by noticing facts as they occur without any attempt to influence the frequency of their occurrence, or to vary the circumstances under which they occur. This is observation. Second, by putting in action causes and agents over which we have no control, and purposely varying their combination, and then noticing what effects take place. This is experiment. To these two sources we must look as the fountains of all natural science." End quote. Herschel further writes, quote, "Experience once recognized as the fountain of all our knowledge of nature, it follows that in our study of nature and its laws we ought at once to make up our minds to dismiss as idle prejudices, or at least suspend as premature, all preconceived notion of what might or ought to be the order of nature in any proposed case, and content ourselves as a plain matter of fact with what is. To experience we refer as the only ground for all physical inquiry. But before experience itself can be used to advantage, there is one preliminary step, to make which depends wholly upon ourselves." End quote. It is the absolute dismissal and clearing of the mind of all prejudices from whatever source arising, and the determination to stand or fall by the result of direct appeal to facts in the first instance, and to strict logical deduction from them afterwards. So I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So what he's saying is we need to get rid of all of our predisposed ideas when we make observations and when we actually utilize this experience in experimentation and in observation. So to do that, we can only verify what can be factually proven or shown. Therefore, we have to get rid of our preconceived notions. We have to not assume we understand how it works when we're making the observation. We have to put that aside, because if we do that, well, this is confirmation bias. And confirmation bias does not give us a sound hypothesis, does it? From extracts like these from such men as Newton and Herschel, it can at once be seen that experience and experience alone should be the chief fountain from whence we draw all our data from to form the basis of any hypothesis or theory. If the hypothesis formed is contradicted by the result of any present or future observation or experiment, then such hypothesis will either become untenable or must be so modified as to take in the new fact furnished by the observation and experiment. It is sine non qua of all true philosophy that philosophy should always agree with experience. To the extent that our philosophy of nature fails to agree with our experience, or with the results of observation and experiment, then to that extent it ceases to be philosophy. It may be a hypothesis or even a theory, but certainly it is not true philosophy. So I'm going to pause for a moment here. So philosophy, in the view of this author and in the view of a great many people, is just as important as scientific method in observing things, in verifying things, in proving things out. So understand that. To disregard philosophy, as our modern science has, is to disregard a major portion of finding truth. And it falls into this categorization, then again, of confirmation bias rather than actual observance. And this causes a problem. So when you disregard philosophy, you give in to confirmation bias when you are trying to pursue scientific ways of thinking, and this turns into the art of rhetoric then. Therefore, you can make whatever claims you want and claim the science backs up what you say, but what you've done is you've only experimented to confirm your preconceived notion. This is confirmation bias, and all of our peer-reviewed science today works upon that notion. They will only present the data which reifies what they're presenting. It's the art of rhetoric, folks. This is what guides our scientific discipline today. There's no philosophy at the heart of it. It's just pure rhetoric, plain and simple. They want to prove out their own ideas to further obtain more funding for their ideas. And even if it's flawed, they'll cover up the flaws in it and only give you the data that is carefully cherry-picked to prove out what it is they want. So, because we are not largely trained in our modern education system in the old ways of thinking in the classic education that some of our ancestors had, we're unfamiliar with the art of rhetoric. And this is what's happened. All of our mainstream science has become nothing more than rhetoric or propaganda. And that is a problem, because they've disavowed philosophy in their ways of thinking. But it wasn't that way 100 years ago. There were still a great many people still diligently seeking truth through the sciences, like this guy who wrote this book. So at any rate, we can see here that they've based what they were pursuing here on the rules of philosophy as handed them by Sir Isaac Newton, who was the first to propose this theory of gravitation. So the third rule here, we're going to cover this and then we're going to sign off here because we're running low on time. The third rule, satisfactory explanation of the phenomena sought to be explained. The third rule, which governs the making of any hypothesis, is that the hypothesis formed is in accordance with the first and second rules and shall satisfactorily account for all phenomena sought to be explained. Newton writes on this point as follows, quote, "No more causes of natural things are to be admitted than such as are true and sufficient to explain the phenomena," end quote. Well, again, in his fourth rule, he states, quote, "In experimental philosophy, propositions collected by induction from phenomena are to be regarded as accurately true or very nearly true, notwithstanding any contrary hypothesis, till other phenomena occur by which they are made more accurate or are rendered subject to exceptions," end quote, and that is from his Principia, Book 3. Herschel, in his Natural Philosophy, points out that one of the chief requirements for any assumed hypothesis is that it shall be sufficient to account for the phenomena to be explained, and that it shall be suggested by analogy. Aha, going to pause for a moment. Analogy. This, in and of itself, is so very important to the way in which we think. We can always apply this law of analogy to explain things. This is something that falls fundamentally in the realm of philosophy, but it is true. It is observable. It is knowable. You can understand things by analogy. Why do you think Jesus taught in the form of parables in the Bible? It's this law of analogy. Sometimes you can only understand a thing as described in an analogous story with this law of analogy, or you could better understand it. And this is something that's hugely important. Now, the object of this work is to give a physical explanation of the cause of the working of gravitation, and to show how, by the properties, qualities, and motions of the universal ether, universal gravitation may be accounted for on a physical basis, so that every phenomenon associated with or included in the law of gravitation should receive a satisfactory physical explanation by the proposed theory. Thus, the physical cause of the centripetal and centrifugal forces should receive the first time a physical explanation. Newton's laws of motion, insofar as they conform to his own rules of philosophy, should also receive a physical explanation. Kepler's laws, which govern the motion of planets in their orbits, should also receive a similar physical explanation. Indeed, all phenomena which the law of gravitation explains from a mathematical standpoint ought to receive a physical explanation by the proposed new conception of the ether medium. In addition to the outstanding physical cause of gravitation, there are other physical problems that yet remain to be solved, as, for example, there is the question as to what is the relative motion of ether to moving matter. Does the ether move with matter through space, as suggested by Michelson and Morley's experiment of America, or does it flow freely through all matter, as it is usually thought to do? I premise I will give a satisfactory solution to this problem in due course. Again, in relation to the phenomena of light, there is still outstanding the problem of the physical explanation as to the transverse vibration of light. This problem will also be dealt with from the standpoint of our new conception of the ether. Whether it will be satisfactorily solved as physical cause of gravitation remains to be seen. Further, there's also the important question, yet unsolved, as to what matter is. Lord Kelvin and Dr. Larmor have recently given to the world a certain conception as to the origin of matter, and I shall endeavor to show that such conceptions receive confirmation and support by the proposed new conception of the ether. Another problem that will be attacked and solved will be the cause of the permanent magnetism of the Earth, with an answer to some of the questions propounded by Professor Schuster at the British Association of 1892 relative to the magnetism of solar bodies. There is certainly some physical explanation as to the cause of the Earth being a magnet, yet up to the present no satisfactory physical theory has been given, and I would pause to say, still to this day, we don't know. And there's many of these things that we don't know, at least not in the mainstream physics model of things. So we're going to wrap it up here. So this is a very interesting book. I would suggest if you're more interested in learning what this guy postulates, you could look it up and actually read it for yourself. But these are the fundamental ideas he went with in approaching this subject. And I think he came pretty close. Now, when you begin to understand that very likely gravity and electromagnetism are two perturbations of the same force, you begin to understand things. One has its effects in the physical, that would be the electromagnetic force. One has its effects in the medium, that is the ether, and this is something that really needs more study to understand. Now, the notion of the ether is reified through the ancient philosophies over and over again. It was an accepted fact in ancient science that this medium exists, the ether, and that light itself is a manifestation in the ether, much like sound is a manifestation in the physical, in the air here. So when you could use the law of analogy to compare and contrast these things, you have a better understanding. And when you apply the rules of nature, these simple observable facts of nature to things, you understand nature is simple and that the simplest explanation is often the best. When you look and you see pressure mediation as a plausible explanation for this, it seems to be probably the most correct. Now, as to the application of technologies to affect this medium called the ether, I don't know what the true state of that is, but I suspect within the auspices of the military-industrial complexes, black budget programs, and special access programs, they are far in advance of anything we see in the public realm, and perhaps they are able to manipulate this medium and cause very real effects here in the physical. with these technologies. It's an interesting course of study, and it's something that perhaps we will pursue here a little bit further in the future. But as for now, we're going to end it right there and sign off. I want to thank you all for tuning in, and I want to remind you I appreciate each and every one of you. We'll catch you next time. Have a good one now. Discover the amazing, clinically proven health benefits of original Tahitian noni. Original Tahitian noni includes powerful antioxidants, adaptogens, nutrients, and phytonutrients to naturally boost energy levels, immune system function, and overall health. Meticulously sourced from French Polynesia, this is the original superfruit. Accept no imitations. Original Tahitian noni. Visit ATR Health at alchemicaltechrevolution.com. and click on the Shop Here tab for more details.
But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.